basic point that in 1960, the CO2 concentration was roughly 320 or so parts per million in the atmosphere. And by today, it has risen to 380. In fact, it's now around about 400. So this looks to be a very dramatic increase in carbon dioxide concentrations. The basic science about the heating effect of carbon dioxide is extremely well established. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere acts as a one-way blanket. That is to say, it allows sun's energy coming through onto the Earth, but then it holds much of that energy back in the atmosphere rather than allowing it to go back out into space, so that there is a net heating effect. That is established beyond any reasonable doubt. So just look at that from 1960 to 2010, and this is what you find. If you put this in long-term perspective, it goes back to 400,000 years. This track shows carbon dioxide concentrations back to 400,000 years ago, and you can see that they fluctuate between 200 parts per million and about 300 parts per million back, in fact, to 800,000 years. And then on this time scale, the Keeling curve looks like a vertical line straight up from 320 to 400. That's how fast global concentrations of CO2 have been going up beyond any level reached in the past 400,000 or indeed 800,000 years. That's how unprecedented a situation that we are in. And the track of global temperature shows that there is a close correlation between CO2 concentrations and temperature. Now, I want to, just before I move on to the question of why hasn't this become a really serious political issue, I want to show you two really remarkable charts which confront two of the main arguments that are used by climate skeptics. I'm skipping over the point that there are there's a small number of very articulate, very vociferous climate skeptics that are sowing doubt about the basic climate science. So this is one of the main claims that the climate skeptics make. They say that in the past 15 years, there's been no increase in surface temperatures at the same time as CO2 concentrations have gone up. This is the claim that my friend, who worked at the Ford Foundation in Delhi, made, and which really shocked me into looking into this whole subject. He said there's been no increase in surface temperatures in the past 15 years, while carbon dioxide concentrations are going up. So what is the science of this? Well, since 1970, this is the track of global surface, the average global surface temperatures. And you can see that there have been periods, in fact, there have been 5 periods of pauses, or periods when there's been very little increase in temperature, even as carbon dioxide concentrations go up. And in each of these periods of pause, this one, for example, there's a rush of media coverage from the skeptics saying, you see, global warming is not real, as in we have had this pause. And now there's been a great deal of writing by the climate skeptics about this one. This is the last 15 years. See, there's no increase in global temperature, therefore global warming is not a real phenomenon. But you can see the point. You can see how they are cherry-picking little bits of data to support this case. What you should be concentrating on is this red line, the point being that the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature is a stochastic relationship. It goes up and down. It's not deterministic. There are other factors affecting that relationship. Nobody says that carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases more generally are the only thing that's affecting temperatures. So other things do matter, but the long-term trend of temperature increase is just undeniable. A second common claim that the skeptics make is to do with Arctic ice. And so there was a rush of media coverage in August 2013 to say that Arctic ice, this is the late summer ice, was 60% more extensive than it had been in the previous year. So, in other words, far from the Arctic ice melting, disappearing over time, it was growing. It was becoming more extensive. In fact, it was becoming 60% more extensive. See, so there is recovery in Arctic ice. There's no continued shrinkage, they say, and therefore global warming is not a real phenomenon. And this is what you find if you measure the extension of Arctic ice. So there have been 9 periods since 1970 when there has been an increase in Arctic ice in the late summer compared to the previous year. There have been 9 of these periods. And again, as with the earlier 2 charts that I showed, every time there is an increase in the extension of Arctic ice, the media is full of reports from the climate skeptics to say the Arctic ice has rebounded, so global warming is not real. But again, you can see the point. You can see how they are cherry-picking data, because this is the real trend in Arctic ice. The long-term trend is that in the past 3 decades, the Arctic has lost 75% of summer ice volume. So this is the situation. The phenomenon is real. It is becoming acute. And the question that I want to ask is this. Why is it that the movement is all going in the wrong direction and politicians are not really reacting except in a rhetorical way? When I say movement on the ground is in the wrong direction, what I'm meaning, for example, is that there has been no absolute decoupling between GDP growth and emissions. There's been no absolute decoupling. There's been a small amount of relative decoupling. What I mean by that is this. I have to show you. If this is the trend of GDP growth on a global scale, then relative decoupling, and if there's no decoupling at all, then emissions, this is emissions, emissions grow at the same rate as GDP. If there's relative decoupling, emissions grow at a slower rate, but emissions grow. Therefore, each increment of GDP is associated with an increase in emissions, but a reducing rate of growth of emissions. Absolute decoupling means this. GDP growth and emissions growth going down. And my point is we have to get to the point of absolute decoupling. There is absolutely no sign of absolute decoupling happening yet. That's point number 1. Point number 2, the energy companies have already booked reserves of oil and coal, which are several times the headroom in terms of the amount of tons of greenhouse gases that we have to limit ourselves to if the UN target of an increase in global temperatures of 2 degrees centigrade above 1880 levels is to be met. The headroom that we have left is around about 1 trillion tons, and the point here is that the energy companies are booking reserves which would produce far more than 1 trillion tons of global of greenhouse gases. That's the second point. The third point is that nothing has been done so far to curb the 1,000 billion year which is being spent on bringing oil reserves into production. So things are going in completely the wrong direction. And of course, coal is a real disaster story in terms of greenhouse gases. It remains the main fuel for electricity generation on a world scale. It's growing at 2% a year. And governments are heavily subsidizing the consumption of coal. So I'm going to skip these slides, except I can't resist reminding you of what's happening in India as the Indian coal rush goes on, and the current government is pledged to redouble the efforts to bring in coal production. In fact, the power minister said recently that India will double its use of domestic coal by 2019. Some people are saying that India is the biggest challenge in global climate negotiations, not China, although I would have to add the the Americans are a big challenge in global climate negotiations too. There is some good news, and I have to just tell you that over lunch I had the pleasure of meeting B.K. Chandrasekhar, who has been leading a group in Bangalore to produce a green growth strategy for Karnataka. And I took a quick look at the documents, and I'm very impressed at the documents. But then, of course, the question is, how will these documents be translated into action? But I do keep looking for little green shoots of optimism, because there are actually not very many green shoots of optimism to be found. So I seized upon this with some delight, although he did tell me that, to the best of his knowledge, Maharashtra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and also other states in India have not done the same kind of exercise as has been done for Karnataka. Correct me if I'm wrong in saying that. There are also some good news coming from the technology frontiers, such as, for example, the dramatic fall in the price of solar power output just in the last few years. Also some interesting developments, but not yet commercialized, in terms of much more powerful battery storage, and the combination of much more powerful battery storage plus decentralized solar and wind, that would make a real big difference in terms of energy use. But now I want to come to the main point, which is why no serious action, especially I'm talking about the ACs. ACs means the advanced countries or the developed countries. And I start with this quote from Victor Hugo: "Greater than the tread of mighty armies is an idea whose time has come." And my point is that for some reasons that I want to elaborate on, the time of global warming has not yet come, despite the fact, and this is the paradox, despite the fact that there's almost unanimity in the scientific community about the reality of global warming and the seriousness of the threat that it posed. So the first point as to why this subject has not yet been taken seriously is that the point that public opinion is not yet convinced that global warming is real and acute and actionable. I'm not going to run through the polling evidence, but there is a lot of polling evidence to show that the public, this is in the developed countries, has not accepted the reality of global warming as something that action should be begun to be taken on soon. But that just begs the question, why is public opinion so confused or so rejectionist? And that brings me to my second point, namely that this small group of skeptics, who include very few, very, very few proper climate scientists, have got excellent media access. And the question is, why is it that they've got such excellent media access? And I think the key is the notion of that there is a debate. It is as though there was a serious debate to be had about whether the Earth is round or flat, so that if you must have a debate on this question of whether the Earth is round and flat, that means that whenever a media outlet carries a story about the shape of the Earth, two sides must be presented. And somehow or other, the climate skeptics have succeeded in convincing whoever there is that this is a debate. There are two sides to the debate, and therefore they must get the same kind of access to the media as the climate scientists get. And this, therefore, gives the skeptics an influence in shaping public opinion, which is entirely disproportionately great relative to their numbers or their credibility. But the third reason is more sinister, and I want to spend a bit of time on this one because this is not, I think, generally recognized, which is this, that the third main reason why the public is unmoved by global warming is because various people and organizations have waged organized campaigns of doubt. That's the key phrase, campaigns of doubt against climate science. And you may immediately think that, oh, this is just a conspiracy theory. Yes, it is a conspiracy theory. The conspiracy is real and very dangerous. And I'm drawing on this book by Oreskes and Conway, which is called Merchants of Doubt. And the first point to make about this is that what has been happening with global warming is just the latest in a long line of doubt campaigns. One of the early doubt campaigns was a campaign to discredit the scientific evidence on the effects of smoking on cancer. A second one was to discredit the link between man-made pollution, like carbotechnofluorides, if that's what they were called, and the ozone hole and acid rain, to discredit the science linking human activities, that is the release of these chemicals, and the result of being acid rain and the ozone hole. And there have been several other campaigns of doubt. The premise of the doubt campaigns is a single premise, namely, we must make our pitch that the science is too uncertain for action, action meaning government regulation. So we must convince people we do not need any government intervention, as in regulation, because the science is too uncertain. And this is very effective because if people think that the science is uncertain, they're unlikely to support public policies that would rely on that science. And the playbook for all of these campaigns was first written by R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, one of whose senior executives said in a remarkable moment of candor in an internal communication, doubt is our product. Doubt is our product since it's the best means of competing with the, quote, body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. And ever since then, this was 1969, the doubt campaigners have used this same tactic. Doubt is our product. Who are these organizations? Well, in the US, there is a network of conservative and libertarian think tanks and related organizations. You will know many of these names. The Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and so on. And the Marshall Institute, this one has been very influential in the global warming doubt-sowing campaign. And what unites these think tanks and what provides the driving force of their doubt campaigns is that they are passionately, vehemently anti-government. They believe in Hayek's road to serfdom. That is, they believe that the British, Hayek, you remember, said that the beginning of the British National Health Service would be the beginning of Britain going on the road to serfdom. And you may be surprised to know that in 2010, Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which was published as long ago as 1944, was number 240 on Amazon's bestseller list. So why was it being sold in such large numbers in 2010? Because conservative commentators were telling people that Hayek's Road to Serfdom was a guide to what the Obama government was trying to do to America by introducing Obamacare, the attempt at a national health service for the United States. And this message that Obamacare was the beginning of the road to serfdom in the United States went down very well in American conservative and libertarian circles. And so these organizations have a ready audience, a ready listener base who are prepared to believe this message that the American government, in fact, all government, is predatory, is keen to get control of society, to send society down the road of serfdom, and therefore they interpret the efforts of the scientists to warn us about the dangers of global warming in this frame of reference. They say that the scientists are making a giant hoax. They are making a scam. They are tricking us all in believing the reality of global warming in order to pave the way for the road to serfdom. That is, the road for more government intervention. That's the logic of what they're doing. And so there are several reasons that I've mentioned so far as to why this issue has not got serious traction on political agendas. First is that the public is unmoved. Then that raises the question, why is the public unmoved? Well, one answer I've given is because these skeptics have quite disproportionate influence in the media, but more specifically, some of the skeptics are organized in these campaign groups that are quite actively, in a conspiratorial way, trying to sow doubts. And so they are the ones producing the kind of evidence, in quotation marks, that I alluded to earlier about, for example, the Arctic ice or about the pause in global temperatures. However, that's not the end of the story. We also have to recognize that the issue itself is really, really difficult for people to get their minds around. It's a wicked problem, not a tame problem. And it's so wicked, so difficult to get our minds around that most of us prefer not even to contemplate it. And so I want to just illustrate this point about it as a wicked problem rather than a tame problem. It's a wicked problem in the sense that, for example, efforts to solve it, to curb carbon dioxide emissions, cause huge other problems, not least they may well cause some slowdown in economic growth. And it is perfectly appropriate for politicians in India and elsewhere to be very worried about the efforts to curb emissions leading to a slowdown of economic growth. That's perfectly appropriate for them to be worried about that. Another reason why it's a wicked problem is because any solution requires huge behavioral changes on the part of many people, and so on. But there is also some bit more specific reasons. This one, I think, is really important in explaining why it's so difficult for the issue of global warming to get traction. And the point is very simple, which is that any event like a great flood or a great drought, the long drought in California, for example, or a hurricane, any weather event can be interpreted simply as a contingent weather event that is not part of some larger phenomenon, which the larger phenomenon becoming simply more frequent. Each event is simply treated as a one-off event, and therefore it's much more difficult for climate scientists and others, environmental activists, to communicate the idea that there is a general problem here, a general problem of global warming, which is producing a rising frequency of these weather events. So it's in the nature of the phenomenon that it's difficult for it to be construed as a problem, as a kind of category problem that there must be action directed towards. And then two more reasons which make the whole thing even more wicked, namely that solutions require some degree of international cooperation between states, and secondly, it's an intergenerational problem because the problem persists in the atmosphere for so long. Once the gases are up there, they stay up there for multiple generations, and therefore the question of how much action we should take today to reduce our emissions today involves the question of how much value we place on the welfare of future generations, and that, of course, is a rather difficult question. And so I want to come now to the question of what to do. I think that the conference in Paris at the end of this year might be the last chance, although of course it's very easy to say, as each of these climate conferences fails, like Copenhagen fails, then the next one that comes along, everybody says that's the last chance, and then that one fails. And so then when the one after that comes along, people say this is the last chance, and so on. You have a rolling series of last chances. That's always the danger. But there is at least the possibility that we are fast approaching climate thresholds now, such that the Paris conference will be the last chance. So what are some leading ideas to keep in mind? I think the first leading idea to keep in mind as to what to do and why we must act is this one, that we should be operating on the principle of ensuring against extreme outcomes. And the example I like to make is that is this one, a question to you. Would you overtake a car on a corner, on a blind corner, on the grounds that you could not be certain that there was not a car coming around the corner in the opposite direction? Your answer obviously would be no. You would not overtake a car on the grounds that you were not certain that there was not a car coming. And we should apply this very same principle to global warming. Yes, there are uncertainties, but we should be acting against extreme outcomes, because what we do know, despite the uncertainties, is that the possibility of extreme outcomes is by no means negligible. So we should be acting to ensure against extreme outcomes. Secondly, this is a moral principle. We could spend all evening debating it, but I think that we do have a similar obligation to our descendants, as we have benefited from in the same way that we have benefited from the efforts of our antecedents to improve the world that we are living in. We know the broad direction of policy. We have to to make it more costly to emit carbon and other greenhouse gases. That's very clear. Secondly, we know that innovation must be speeded up. There are possibilities out there on the frontier, but we have to concert efforts to bring in these possibilities, such as, for example, improved battery storage. The role of government is critical. Governments have to keep this issue, or get this issue, up to near the top of the political agenda. And that means, for example, making a real priority to reach a concordat, not a consensus, but a concordat between the main political parties, that global warming and energy policy, saving energy, renewable energy, that these things will be sustained across multiple governments. So this means that government must take the role in long-term planning, not only for itself, but encouraging businesses and others to do long-term planning. That means forecasting the future from the present, but it also means backcasting. Backcasting means developing a vision of a viable world decades ahead, and then working backwards from that vision into what we have to do today. I'm always reminded of a quip by Helmut Schmidt, who made this quip in the context of hearing people in Germany, economists in Germany, say we must develop a vision of the future of the German economy. And his response to them was, people who have visions should see a doctor. That was his way of dismissing the whole idea of planning. We have to be very serious about planning, but not just long-term planning. It's very easy to set targets for 2050 or 2030. We need to break targets down into much shorter term intervals and establish things like an independent monitoring agency to monitor progress towards the short-term as well as the long-term targets, and to have that agency obliged to report to parliaments every 2 years, for example, maybe every 4 years, and to oblige parliaments to debate the reports. These things can be done. The procedures can be codified if there's a will to do it. There must be industrial policy, although I know this is a toxic phrase, and so it's better to call it something else. It could be production policy. But in one way or another, governments have to be more active in a microeconomic way in pushing innovation, in pushing energy saving, using tools that might be called industrial policy tools. And this green strategy for Karnataka sets out some ideas about how to use government policy instruments in order to advance this agenda. One very important point is this. It's to do with how this whole idea of action is presented to the public. A common mistake so far has been that the public has been presented with threats, has been made anxious in the hope that this will somehow induce the public to take global warming as seriously, as a serious issue. But this emphasis upon negatives, upon provoking fear, is actually counterproductive. People tend to just reject the whole thing if they are approached in terms of fear, particularly because global warming does not constitute a clear external enemy in a way that, let's say, North Korea constitutes a clear and tangible, graspable external enemy. Global warming is not like that for the reasons that I said. It's a wicked kind of enemy. And so we have to emphasize the positives, such as the opportunities for energy efficiency in terms of home insulation. This is for northern climates. Home insulation, but presented in terms of the advantages of better home insulation in terms of comfort, for example, or the advantages in terms of saving household money, as distinct from linking home insulation to solving global warming, because that just doesn't go down. It doesn't mean anything to most people. Or again, opportunities for energy security. If we have more decentralized energy production with wind and solar, for example, plus storage, battery storage, for example, that will give us much better energy security than when we have to rely on importing huge amounts of oil and natural gas and so on, and then distributing the energy through enormous integrated grids, which are very vulnerable to all kinds of mishaps. Decentralized production plus decentralized storage would give us much better energy security. So that's another positive. And a third kind of positive would be health benefits of reduced fossil fuel emissions. The next point is we have to be very serious about enlisting corporate support. And it's a common failing of environmentalists that they think of the corporate sector as kind of an enemy, something to be battled with. But within the corporate sector, there are big differences of interest and willingness to support a global warming agenda. For example, in the United States, Obama has produced a plan to curb emissions from power plants. And this has led to a great split in the US corporate sector, with the consumer businesses such as Kellogg's, Starbucks, Levi Strauss, Nike, and many others strongly in support of the Obama plan to limit emissions from power stations and other things that can be done by the US government, whereas the industrial businesses equally strongly oppose any such move to curb emissions from power stations, such as the American Petroleum Institute, the National Association of Manufacturers, and many other groups. And they say, and you can guess what they say, their core claim is that any such moves to, for example, the move to curb emissions from power stations, will make our companies uncompetitive in world markets. This is the mantra, and it is a very effective mantra in persuading the public that maybe it's not a good idea to curb emissions from power stations. And just now coming to the end, international cooperation well, the first point is that the industrial countries must take the lead. They must make bigger proportional cuts in emissions, and developing countries are quite right to insist on this commitment by the industrialized countries. But the second point, and this is a small green shoot of optimism, the second point is that very large cuts in emissions could be made by cooperation between a small number of countries. We're not talking of 194 countries as gathered in Lima just last month. We're talking of 2 countries, in the case of the US and China, which together account for more than 50% of global emissions. 2 countries account for more than 50%. It's very unfortunate that the US and China are at loggerheads on so many issues. The US is busy trying to build up China as the next great enemy of the free world, so as to get back into the good old Cold War dynamics. But this, of course, makes cooperation between the US and China rather difficult on many issues. It would be much better if it was the US and Canada Canada producing 29% of global emissions instead of China. Then cooperation would be a whole lot easier. And then only some 15 countries account for something of the order of 80% of global emissions. So you would think that it should not be beyond the wit of man to get a relatively small group of countries to cooperate in reducing emissions, to cooperate in limiting the amount of fossil fuel production that they consume. So that's another small green shoot of optimism. And on that happy note, a slightly happy note, I come to the end. Thank you.
Proving my point about you, the 2 of you being among the 2 most interesting and important economists around. What we'll do is now take questions, because I think time is very limited. I will forego my moderator's right to ask questions of the 2 of you. Can we get a sense of people raise their hands of who has questions? So we get a
question is to the second speaker, Mr. Robert Wade, I think. You mentioned global warming as a wicked problem. Can you think of other problems in history which you would also call wicked problems?
Could I just also say, let's take about 2 questions at a time, and thank you very much. The first question that's addressed to Robert Wade. Please just, specify who you're addressing your question to. The gentleman here.
Professor Chang, your arguments can't be countered, at least not with facts. But my question is, you talked about how many countries have got around the problem, shall we say. There cannot be any kind of cookbook, but are there any methods by which one can do it, or is it just hit and miss? And when you took the Singapore example, Singapore is a small country, authoritarian country, can do many things, change policies, etc. when necessary. It's probably not possible elsewhere, or may not be possible elsewhere.
So let's stop there. There's a third question. There was somebody else. Yes.
So I just have a question for 2 of you. One is to Dr. Chang. About India took a similar position when we got independent. There were protectionist policies in place, and it was asked by the corporations itself. But on the way, somewhere we missed, and then we changed the framework altogether. And now where we stand, to make sense of what you are saying is a bit tough for the current scenario. How do you sort of enforce that idea to the nation states? And second, to Dr. Robert Wade, that one of the things which the negotiations, I was in the negotiations too, one of the things which we were frustrated were that you have action plans which are all voluntary across the world, including for the developed countries, which are
voluntary or not voluntary?
The intended nationally determined contribution contributions are looking like all voluntarily, and there is
They're
a
all voluntary.
and there is a push from the developing countrysides, including India, which took a very strange stand of saying that we don't want an independent review and assessment. So what kind of framework which will emerge, and especially even including for the markets, we don't have a position where CDM and other mechanisms which were already in place, there is no hope for them left from 2015 agreement, whatever comes out at that time. So that's a question which all of us, and what is the speculation around that?
Sorry, just let me clarify. I didn't get your question. What is the speculation around what?
The carbon markets, there's the status, there's a question mark left now. Post-Copenhagen, we have no clear idea. And around the INDCs, where do the INDCs stand if they are all voluntary commitments and have no assessment and review?
The first question was to you. That second,
Well, many of the issues that governments deal with are tame problems. They're reasonably easy to define, to set objectives for, the methods of resolving them. And just off the top of my head, I can't think of other wicked problems. There are other wicked problems. I mean, this is a term in the literature, but I don't immediately recall what other kind of issues meet these characteristics. And I'm not actually sure why you asked the question. That is, what was your interest in asking the question, whether you had some other follow-up in mind.
yeah, please do.
Intergenerationality. In terms of, like, you say climate change is about, it's about the future generation, so that's one aspect. So something that you can't see immediately, I just asked the question.
Curiosity, I guess.
Yeah, there's no question. When you have an issue which is so persistent over multiple generations, then the question of how much to act today and what costs to bear today becomes much influenced by how much you are prepared to value the welfare of future generations. And I'm not a philosopher, but it strikes me that we don't have any reasonably clear guidelines about valuing the future. So much depends then on the discount rate that we apply for costs and benefits accruing several generations down the line. And as you will know, the report of Nick Stern has been quite strongly criticized because it assumes a very low discount rate, meaning a very high value attached to benefits that will accrue generations down. And some people say that's simply, given that we will be wealthier, our descendants will be wealthier. That's an assumption, by the way. They will be wealthier, they'll be more knowledgeable. Then the more of the cost should be paid by them rather than us now. So just how you reach a political agreement about action today and in the next few decades in this kind of context, I really don't know. And that actually brings me to your question. You're right that, for example, the Lima Accord that was heralded as a breakthrough is no breakthrough, in particular because countries were simply asked to report what they were going to commit to do by 2030 in terms of reducing emissions. But it is all kind of voluntary, and there is no monitoring mechanism, and there's no requirement, for example, to phase out subsidies for fossil fuels. It is ridiculous that the American government is subsidizing fossil fuel production. In other words, far from putting a net disincentive in place for fossil fuel production, the American government is giving a positive incentive for fossil fuel production, even as it tries to encourage the development of renewables. So it's doing contradictory things. At the very least, it should remove the subsidies for fossil fuels. So yes, the targets are voluntary, and also there is no serious discussion about how negotiation about how the burden of emission reduction will be shared amongst countries. That issue hasn't been touched. And the second thing is that the issue of financial help from the developed countries to developing countries to install fossil fuel emission reducing technologies, that issue of financial help has not been addressed at all. But if you're trying to be optimistic, and I keep trying to be optimistic, you can regard this in the Chinese metaphor of crossing the river by just one stone at a time. You can regard all this effort as very small baby steps towards what we must do, and hopefully repeated failure will eventually lead, before it's too late, to serious effort as minds become clarified about the nature of what exactly it is that has to be agreed. So you can be optimistic if you regard even something as weak as the Lima Accord in November as just an early step. I mean, early in the time scale of these things. We've been moving in this direction since Rio in 1992, and we're still really, we haven't reached first base, but the time scale involved, it just will take a long time. The question is whether we will reach serious action before we hit climate thresholds. That's the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, on the first one, yes, I mean, things like political system, size, homogeneity, and so on does matter. So, the general view is that if you are small, if you are homogeneous, if you have authoritarian politics, then you do better. But I don't really subscribe to that view. I mean, for example, Singapore might be small, but it's not homogeneous at all. I mean, it's the multi-ethnic society, and also the Japan, which used these policies, is a big country. 150 million people. Of course, then people talk about homogeneity, but then Japan's not exactly that homogeneous, but. More importantly, being homogeneous doesn't mean that you love each other.
Well,
Yeah.
No, I wasn't
Yeah.
trying to contradict you.
No. I mean that I wasn't necessarily saying that you are subscribing to this view. So, that for example, Sweden. You think Sweden being small and homogeneous was destined to be a society where everyone loves each other? In the 1920s, it had the worst industrial relations in the world. It lost the largest number of working days due to industrial strikes per worker in the world. So that they had to come to this grand bargain where, basically the capitalists agreed to pay more taxes to provide a welfare state, and workers that restrain their rights to strike and so on. So that's how they managed it. And also in the very longer term, countries are usually not born homogeneous. They are made homogeneous. This is known as nation building. So there's this very interesting book written by American historian called Eugene Weber, which is titled Peasants into Frenchmen. And he starts from early 19th century, where apparently 40% of French kids in French schools did not speak French as a first language. And so he goes through the socialization process, that spread of mass education, the military conscription, the spread of mass media, and so on, to figure out how the identity called Frenchness was forged. And even in contemporary world, that Tanzania is officially the most genetically diverse country in the world, despite that they have built this sense of the Tanzanianness. Yeah? So if you meet a Maasai from Tanzania, he will say, I'm a Tanzanian, and then I'm a Maasai. If you meet a Maasai from Kenya, he will say, I'm a Maasai, and then I'm a Kenyan. Yeah? So you can't change those things. I mean, it's an art, there's no kind of manual to tell you how to do it. But, this is where history comes in very useful, because unlike in science, that you can experiment with people. I mean, well, they have done it, Stalin, the IMF, they've all done live experiments with real people, but let's try to avoid that, and let's learn from history. So that's my response. Why did India fail with those policies? Well, there are many reasons, but let me put it in a dramatic way. In the 1950s, neither Japan, nor Brazil, nor India could build good cars. The Brazilian approach was, we cannot build good cars, but we want good cars. So let's invite Renault, Fiat, and Ford to come and build good cars for us. Of course, then they had to provide protection, and the industry was inward-looking, resulted in inefficiency. The Indian approach was, we cannot build good cars, but we don't want good cars. Those are imperialist cars. We will drive around in Austin Ambassador forever. We don't want good cars. The Japanese approach was, we cannot build good cars. We can only build shit cars, but we'll drive around in shit cars until we can build good cars. I'm grossly simplifying, but there were differences in outlook. And the policies that used were geared towards those outlooks, which meant that these three countries went in very different ways. So yes, I think earlier problem with India was that it did not want to engage with the world economy and believed in the kind of self-sufficiency and so on. But I say it was a delusion, because after all, you were using someone else's technology to produce cars. It was British Austin 1950s technology. So what's wrong with that? Keeping importing better technologies so that you can use those to get to higher places. So I think there was a fundamental problem with that outlook. But let's not totally dismiss what happened in India in the past, because saying that India is now growing fast all because of this liberalization is like my son later saying when he gets a job, saying to me that, well, I got this job and I don't owe you anything. Well, I fed you, I sent you to school, So that India has all the engineers and all the manufacturing capabilities, all the the skilled workers, only because of those earlier policies. So you have to put that into perspective.
Thank you. Before we go around, I'd like to see the hands up, and I think Robert Wade would like to ask something. Where are the questions? Let me look around.
I just want to add a comment. I want to add a comment about protection, because protection is often very wrongly conceptualized in terms of simply high protection or low protection. There's a big difference between Indian-style protection, which resulted in 1955 British Morris Austin technology being reproduced decade after decade in the form of the Ambassador car. I suffered long car rides in the Ambassador car when I was doing my field work in the late 70s and the early 1980s. But that's the form of protection which is bad, because it simply removes all international competitive pressure. The key point, the key difference between Indian-style protection and East Asian-style protection is that the protection in East Asia was designed in a way that did not remove all international competitive protection on the protected producers. It moderated the degree of international competitive pressure on them. It modulated it. It gave them a time period in which they could adjust to the full blast of international protection. It did not altogether remove international competitive pressure from them, and that makes a fundamental difference in the economic effects. Therefore, you cannot just think of protection in terms of high, medium, or low protection, or moving protection up or down. The key thing is how the protection is designed, whether it removes international competitive pressure altogether, as it did in India, or whether it simply moderates the degree to which producers are exposed to international competitive pressure through various kinds of devices, such as the government setting performance standards to be met by the protected firms, making it clear that if they did not meet these standards within, say, 5 years, the protection would be removed. End of story. So that's an important distinction.
The gentleman here a bit, and then the gentleman next to it.
The degree to which producers are exposed to international competitive pressure through various kinds of devices, such as the government setting performance standards to be met by the protected firms, making it clear that if they did not meet these standards within, say, 5 years, the protection would be removed. End of story. So that's an important distinction.
The gentleman here a bit, and then the gentleman next to it.
Question about innovation with respect to global warming. And the question is, you talk about two big countries, US and China. They have extremely different systems with respect to the role of state versus market. And we want to understand why in both countries you don't see an adequate response. Now in the US one can speculate. For example, Obama had this green manufacturing as one of his big agenda items when he was running for president. It sort of dies down, nothing happens. And so one has to ask the question whether there is something in the nature of contemporary American capitalism where financing is not going towards those areas with a slightly longer term return. But this same thing cannot be said. And why I say that is that I know that the venture capital funds have dried up, at least a few years ago, had dried up going towards solar thing, and they were actually willing to invest in China. American venture capital money was willing to go to China because they didn't think that there was much. So in other words, there is a whole mechanism of investment that militates against the kind of longer term investment that could have been possible 25 years ago in the US. But in today's China, where they are in a relatively more secure position compared to India, why is it, or is it that they are not really responding to the climate challenge, and what prevents them from going ahead? Because the value of doing something there is, in the longer run, is very, very high. We hear that they've done a lot. That's why I'm asking.
Next question.
So my question is to Dr. Chang. A lot of what you spoke about was on the role of the state in protection or otherwise of industry and investment in industry. What are your views on the other great debate currently on the role of the state in social welfare spending or in social capital formation?
Yeah. And then there's a question at the back there.
I think both the speakers highlighted the role of ideology as a barrier to pragmatic policy. But I have a question that I think could be more relevant for Mr. Chang about why pragmatic policy and grand theory being incompatible with each other, because I think grand theories tend to be connected to ideologies. Why do you think there is an inability to divorce policy from ideology, economic policy specifically?
Right, okay. Yeah, first on the issue of social welfare, well, my position is that if you actually design it well, it actually encourages structural change and economic growth, contrary to popular perception. This is particularly well done in Scandinavia. Once again, to put it simply, in Scandinavia, if you lose your job, you will get, depending on the country, between 55 and 70% of your former wage. Up to 2 years, you will get subsidized training. They'll even help you relocate to another city by lending you a bridging loan to buy another house, and all that is there. So in those countries, it's not the end of the world if you lose your current job. Whereas in the United States, if you lose your job, you can even go to a hospital. So no wonder, of course, most US workers are not organized, so they cannot fight it. But organized workers in auto industry and steel industry and so on, they'll fight to death. Yeah? I would do the same if I were in their position. Yeah? So actually, having a good welfare state makes workers less resistant to structural change and growth. This is why Finland in the last 30, 40 years has grown 1.5 times faster, 2.7% per capita in per capita terms, as opposed to the 1.8% in the US, despite having a welfare state that is 1.5 times bigger than that of the United States. Yeah? Because the US spends about 20% of GDP on social spending, public social spending. Finland spends 30%. Actually, the US, if you include the private spending, also spends about 30% because their healthcare cost is going through the roof. Yeah? So I think we need to have an integrated strategy between industrial upgrading and social welfare upgrading. And that's how I would put it. Well, why is ideology more popular than pragmatism? I think is that your question. Unfortunately, people like simple answers. Yeah? And we have always looked for the golden the solution, silver bullet, or whatever metaphor you want to use. So usually the reason why people having more complicated nuanced view is less popular is because they are more difficult to understand. It's a lot easier if you say liberalize the market, everything will be fine. Yeah, I mean people will fall asleep if you say, well, you have to do the following 57 things subject to the following 43 conditions. Yeah. So unfortunately, there's always the bias towards the simple ideological solution. But I believe that, as I, to an extent, try to do, I mean, even those the more kind of nuanced views can be delivered in a more kind of simplified way. Simplified but not simplistic, I hope, way if you put your effort into it. So I think that people advocating those views also need to think about different delivery strategy and so on. But yes, I mean, unfortunately, people like black and white, and they like want 3 bullet points instead of 27. So,
thank you.
Thanks. I agree with the main point of the question, which is that there is a serious problem of misallocation in investment markets, such that investments that would be helpful for reducing global warming are underinvested, and those which are not helpful are overinvested. Just as an example, over the 2000s, the huge flow of investment funds went into lending for houses in the form of mortgages in the United States, or lending for consumer credit, that is credit card debt, or lending for automobile loans and so on. And the reason why this enormous flow of finance into these kind of lending vehicles was because that was where the profit, the rate of return was highest. The rate of return on lending for consumer credit, or for automobile loans, or student loans, or for house purchases was higher than the rate of return on investing in, say, renewable energy production. And so that's why it happened. And the second point is that Mariana Mazzucato has written an important book called The Entrepreneurial State. And in this, she looks at the record of American venture capital firms, and she classifies a number of innovations or uses of investment in terms of high risk, low risk, and high capital intensity and low capital intensity. And basically she shows empirically that venture capital overwhelmingly has gone into the low-risk, low capital intensity uses, leaving the high-risk, high capital intensity, long duration investments for the state to finance. And if the state, as the American state, is somewhat reluctant to become involved in that way, that means that that whole category of things with high risk and high capital intensity gets neglected as a opportunity for investment. So that book, Mariana Mazzucato, it's an Italian name, Mazzucato, The Entrepreneurial State, provides a lot of interesting material about how financial markets are working to misallocate investment away from uses that might be helpful for reducing global warming. On the point about China and innovation policies, my understanding is that there's been huge investment in solar power in China, as well as huge investment in coal, of course, coal-powered fire stations. I think that a lot of the investment that's gone into solar and also into wind is decided at provincial level, with provinces competing with each other to attract foreign firms and to cultivate Chinese firms within their provinces to develop these capabilities. So the Chinese government, the Chinese state, has been very important in developing these very large-scale investments in renewables in China, which, as I say, go alongside of this also very heavy investment in coal and other fossil fuel intensive industries. So China is really riding two horses at once, with the idea that by 2030, this is in the US-China Accord that was agreed with Obama in November, the idea that by 2030 it will begin to cut its emissions. What is paradoxical about that agreement, which was hailed as a great achievement, what is paradoxical is that that stipulation, we will begin to cut emissions by 2030, means it builds in an incentive for China to increase emissions between now and 2030, so that it will be really, really easy for it to cut emissions after 2030. There's something terribly wrong in the content of that US-China accord that was hailed as such a breakthrough.
Thank you very much. It's been a very exciting and interesting evening. I think it's time to draw to a close, unless someone has some very pressing, urgent question.
No.
There's one last question. One last question, right? Please.
Good evening. I'll try and keep this short, most of which Dr. Chang answered, in fact. So the first question is that, is the state really autonomous from forces within and outside? That is the forces of global capital and international financial institutions, something which you alluded to. But secondly, are you seeing a new regime of protectionism and regulation, in the sense that with the state subsidizing corporates, which is something you see in India, and outsourcing some of their fundamental capacities, that is the traditional roles, especially in welfare. So would you say that there's a new regime of protectionism or regulation or intervention that is being shaped or carried out? So I think I've kept it really fast.
Right, yeah, thank you. Well, of course, I mean, the global financial market is a big constraint on what countries can do, especially if they have an open capital market. So, I mean, that's the last thing that you want to have if you want to pursue a policy that's different from what the orthodoxy wants. But having said that, the international the financial market is more interested in making money than ideology. So, I mean, if you begin to do well with the unconventional policy, look at China. China does virtually everything wrong, according to the orthodoxy, but they still go there and invest. So, I mean, my view of international capital is that they'll never come and make you rich, but once you become rich, they'll come. Yeah? But yes, I think there's this worrying trends towards the use of these policy tools basically to promote corporate interests rather than to really initiate the national development. So you have to watch out because some of these people could be using the rhetorics like the ones I have used, but basically to make life comfortable for their corporate friends rather than to really advance economic development. Because what really distinguishes countries like Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, and so on is, yeah, you will get a lot of money and help from the government, but if you don't perform, you are not going to get them. Yeah? So that unless they deliver that side as well, whatever rhetoric they use, they are not really going to advance the national economy.
Thank you very much indeed. Join me in a round.